What if I told you that some analysts are now predicting that XRP could go from just a few dollars to numbers that sound completely unbelievable? And at the same time, other experts are warning that it might struggle to even move higher from here. So the real question is not just how high XRP can go, but whether this insane prediction is actually possible or just another hype wave that could trap investors at the top. And today we are going to break this down step by step in a way that actually makes sense. Now, let's get into the real discussion because right now the market is filled with very aggressive predictions about XRP. And this is exactly why so many people are confused because on one side, you are seeing headlines claiming XRP could reach 100, $500, or even $1,000 in extreme scenarios. While on the other side, more realistic models are placing XRP somewhere between $2 and $5 in the near term. And this massive gap between predictions is what makes the situation so interesting and also very dangerous for new investors. First, you need to understand where XRP is currently standing in the market because without that, any prediction is just noise. And as of recent data, XRP has been trading around the 1.3 to 1.4 range, showing that despite all the hype, it is still far away from its previous all time high levels, which already tells you something very important. And that is that XRP is not in a full breakout mode yet, but rather in a stage where it is still trying to build strong momentum. Now, here is where things start getting interesting because analysts are not agreeing with each other at all. And this is where the word insane starts to make sense because some forecasts suggest XRP could reach around $3 to $5 by the end of 2026 if everything goes right, including strong institutional inflows and positive regulation, which is considered a realistic bullish scenario in today's market. But at the same time, there are predictions that go far beyond that, with some AI models and analysts suggesting XRP could jump toward $8 or even higher under strong market conditions, which would represent a massive increase from current levels. And this is where hype starts building because such moves are not impossible in crypto, but they require very specific conditions to happen. Now, here comes the extreme side of the prediction, and this is where things become truly insane because there are also claims that XRP could reach $100 or even $1,000 in a full institutional adoption scenario, meaning if global banks, payment systems, and financial institutions start using XRP at a massive scale, then the demand shock could push the price to levels that seem unrealistic today. But before you get too excited, you need to slow down and understand something very important. And that is that these extreme predictions are based on very big assumptions, not current reality. Because for XRP to reach something like $100 or more, it would need to capture a huge portion of the global financial system, especially cross border payments. And that kind of shift does not happen overnight. In fact, some financial models, yeah, suggest that if XRP captures even a small percentage of global payment volume, its price could increase significantly, which shows that real world usage is the key driver behind these predictions, not just hyper speculation. Now, let's talk about why XRP is even getting these kinds of predictions in the first place, because this is not random. And the main reason is its strong connection to real world finance through Ripple's technology, which is designed to make cross border payments faster and cheaper. And and this gives XRP something that many other cryptocurrencies do not have, which is a real use case tied to global finance. Another major factor is regulation. And this is something that has been holding XRP back for years, but now things are starting to change as XRP has recently gained more clarity in its regulatory status, even being treated more like a digital commodity in some discussions, which is a huge shift compared to the uncertainty it faced before. And this brings us to one of the most important points in this entire discussion, which is that XRP's future price is heavily dependent on regulation, institutional adoption, and real usage, not just market hype. And this is exactly why predictions vary so much because different analysts are assuming different outcomes for these factors. So when you see a headline saying XRP will go to $1,000, you need to ask yourself one simple question, which is what needs to happen for that to become reality? Because without that understanding, you are not investing. You're just guessing. Now, in the next part, we are going to go deeper into what is actually driving these predictions. And more importantly, what must happen behind the scenes for XRP to even come close to these insane price targets, because this is where most people completely misunderstand the market. Now, to really understand why these insane XRP price predictions are spreading so fast, you need to look deeper into what is actually driving the market right now, because the price of any asset does not move based on hope alone. It moves based on a combination of demand, utility, and overall market conditions. And in the case of XRP, all three of these factors are slowly starting to come together, but not in the way many people think. The first major driver behind these bold predictions is institutional interest. And this is something that most retail investors do not fully understand, because when big financial institutions enter a market, they do not behave like regular traders who buy and sell based on emotions. Instead, they move based on long term strategies, partnerships, and real use cases. And this is exactly where XRP starts to stand out compared to many other cryptocurrencies. XRP is closely connected to Ripple's payment network, which is designed to help banks and financial institutions move money across borders faster and at a lower cost. And this is a very big deal because the global cross border payment industry is worth trillions of dollars. So even a small percentage of that volume um, moving through XRP could create a strong demand shock. And this is one of the main reasons why some analysts believe XRP has massive upside potential. However, there is something very important you need to understand here, and that is adoption does not happen instantly, because banks and institutions move very slowly when it comes to adopting new technology, especially in the financial sector where security, regulation, and compliance are extremely important. So even if XRP has the technology, the real growth comes step by step, not in a sudden explosion. Now, the second major factor behind these predictions is regulation. And this has been one of the biggest challenges for XRP over the past few years, because uncertainty around legal status made many investors and institutions hesitant to fully commit. But now the situation is starting to shift, and this is creating a new wave of confidence in the market. When there is more clarity and regulation, it reduces risk for big investors. And when risk goes down, capital starts to flow in. And this is exactly how markets grow over time, not through hype, but through confidence. And this is why even small positive developments in regulation can have a big impact on XRP's price movement. At the same time, you also need to consider the overall crypto market cycle, because XRP does not move alone. It moves along with the broader market, especially with major assets like Bitcoin and Ethereum setting the overall direction. And this means even if XRP has strong fundamentals, it still depends on the health of the entire crypto market. For example, during a strong bull run, money flows into the market, starting with large assets and then moving into altcoins like XRP. And this is when you see big price spikes. But during a weak or uncertain market, even strong these strong projects struggle to gain momentum, and this is why timing plays a huge role in price predictions. Now let's talk about something that many people ignore but is extremely important, and that is market psychology. Because in crypto, emotions often drive price movements more than fundamentals in the short term, and this is exactly why you see extreme predictions gaining so much attention. When people hear that XRP could reach $100 or more, it creates excitement and fear of missing out. And this brings more buyers into the market, which can actually push the price higher in the short term. But at the same time, this kind of hype can also create unrealistic expectations, which often leads to disappointment if those targets are not reached quickly. And this is where smart investors separate themselves from the crowd, because instead of chasing hype, they focus on realistic scenarios and long term growth. And this is exactly what you need to do if you want to understand where XRP is really heading. Another important factor is supply and demand. And this is something that directly affects price, but is often misunderstood because XRP has a large total supply compared to some other cryptocurrencies, which means for the price to reach extremely high levels like $100 or more, it would require an enormous amount of capital entering the market. This does not mean it is impossible, but it does mean that such a move would require a massive shift in global financial systems. And this is why realistic predictions tend to stay within lower ranges, while extreme predictions assume a complete transformation of how money moves around the world. Now, here is where things become very interesting, because there is also growing discussion about XRP being used in central bank digital currency systems and global payment infrastructure. And if even a portion of that becomes reality, it could significantly increase demand for XRP, which again brings us back to the idea that utility is the key driver behind long-term price growth. But again, this is not something that happens overnight, and this is where many investors make mistakes, because they expect immediate results from long-term developments. And when that does not happen, they lose confidence and exit the market at the wrong time. So when you look at these insane XRP price predictions, what you are really seeing is a mix of realistic growth expectations and highly optimistic scenarios. And your job as an investor is to understand the difference between the two. Because at the end of the day, XRP's future price will not be decided by headlines or social media hype. It will be decided by adoption, regulation, and real world usage. And this is exactly what we're going to break down in the next part, where we will look at the realistic price targets and compare them with the extreme predictions to see what actually makes sense. Now, let's move into the most important part of this entire discussion, and that is separating realistic XRP price targets from the extreme predictions, because this is where most people either make smart decisions or fall into the trap of unrealistic expectations. And if you truly understand this section, you will start to see the market in a completely different way. First, let's talk about realistic price targets because these are based on current data, market structure, and gradual growth, not on sudden global changes. And according to many analysts, a reasonable bullish range for XRP in the next cycle sits somewhere between $3 and $10, depending on how strong the overall crypto market becomes and how much adoption XRP actually gains. Now, this might not sound insane compared to $100 or $1,000 predictions, but the truth is, even a move from around $1 to $5 is already a massive return. And this is something many people ignore because they are too focused on extreme outcomes instead of understanding how powerful steady growth can be. The reason why this range is considered realistic is because it aligns with historical patterns in the crypto market where assets tend to move in cycles, building momentum slowly and then accelerating during peak phases. And XRP has already shown in the past that it can move quickly when conditions are right. But it has also shown that it does not sustain extreme highs without strong support. Now, let's go a little deeper because there are certain conditions that could push XRP toward the higher end of this realistic range. And the first one is a strong bull market led by major cryptocurrencies, because when the entire market is moving up, liquidity increases, investor confidence grows, and altcoins like XRP benefit from that flow of capital. The second condition is increased adoption of Ripple's payment technology, because if more banks and financial institutions start using XRP for real transactions, it creates actual demand, not just speculative demand. And this is the kind of growth that can support higher price levels over time. The third condition is regulatory clarity, because when there is less uncertainty, more institutional money can enter the market, and this can have a powerful effect on price, especially for an asset like XRP that has been heavily affected by legal issues in the past. Now, let's shift to the other side of the discussion, which is the extreme predictions, because this is where things become very complicated and also very misleading if you do not understand the full picture. When you hear predictions like $100, $500, or even $1,000 for XRP, these are not based on current market conditions. Instead, they are based on future scenarios where XRP becomes a major part of the global financial system, possibly handling a large portion of cross-border payments, or even being integrated into central banking systems. In theory, if XRP were to achieve that level of adoption, then yes, the price could reach very high levels. But here's the problem, and this is something you need to fully understand, and that is the scale required for such a move is extremely large. For example, for XRP to reach $100, its total market value would need to increase to a level that rivals or even exceeds some of the largest financial systems in the world. And this would require not just adoption, but dominance in a very competitive space, which includes traditional banking systems, other cryptocurrencies, and even new financial technologies that are still being developed. So while these extreme predictions are not completely impossible, they are based on long-term transformations that could take many years or may not happen at all in the way people expect. And this is why treating them as short-term targets can be very risky. And another important point is that these predictions often ignore competition. because XRP is not the only solution for cross-border payments, and there are many other projects and technologies trying to solve the same problem, which means XRP would need to outperform all of them to reach those extreme levels. Now, let's talk about something that connects both realistic and extreme scenarios, and that is time, because time is the factor that most people underestimate. And this is where patience becomes one of the most important skills in investing. Realistic targets like $3 to $10 could happen within a typical market cycle, which usually lasts a few years. But extreme targets like $100 or more would likely require a much longer time frame, along with major changes in the financial system. And this is why understanding your time horizon is critical before you make any investment decision. This also brings us to risk, because the higher the target, the higher the uncertainty. And this means if you are only investing based on extreme predictions, you are exposing yourself to a higher level of risk, especially if those predictions do not play out as expected. On the other hand, if you focus on realistic growth while still being aware of long-term potential, you create a more balanced approach, which is exactly how experienced investors think in volatile markets like crypto. So at this point, you should be asking yourself a very simple but powerful question, which is not, can XRP reach $100, but instead, what is the most likely outcome based on current data and trends? Because that question will guide you toward smarter decisions instead of emotional ones. Now, in the next part, we are going to break down what could actually trigger a major XRP breakout, and what signals you should be watching if you want to stay ahead of the market, because timing and awareness are just as important as understanding price targets. Now, let's bring everything together and answer the most important question that has been building throughout this entire discussion, which is whether this insane XRP price prediction is something you should actually believe in or approach with caution, because at this stage you already understand the difference between hype and realistic growth. And this final part is about turning that understanding into a clear mindset. The first thing you need to accept is that both sides of the prediction can exist at the same time, because in the world of crypto, especially with an asset like XRP, there is always a gap between what is possible and what is probable. And confusing these two is where most people make costly mistakes. It is possible for XRP to reach extremely high levels in the long term if global adoption, regulation, and financial integration all align perfectly. But what is probable in the near to mid-term is much more grounded, and that is steady growth based on actual progress, not sudden explosive moves to unrealistic levels. This means when you see headlines claiming XRP will reach $100 or even $1,000, you should not immediately reject them, but you also should not blindly believe them. Instead, you should understand the assumptions behind those predictions, because without those conditions being met, those numbers remain theoretical, not practical. At the same time, you should also not underestimate XRP, because it is one of the few cryptocurrencies that has a clear use case tied to real world finance. And this gives it a strong foundation for long term growth, especially if adoption continues to increase and regulatory clarity improves further. Now, here is where your mindset becomes very important, because successful investors do not focus only on the highest possible outcome. They focus on the most likely outcome while keeping an eye on future potential. And this balanced approach allows them to stay in the market without being driven by emotions. If you only focus on extreme predictions, you may end up holding unrealistic expectations. And when the market does not meet those expectations quickly, it can lead to frustration and poor decisions. But if you focus only on conservative outcomes, you might miss opportunities for growth. And this is why balance is key. Another important point to understand is that the market rewards patience more than excitement because big moves often take time to develop. And during that time, the market can feel slow, uncertain, or even disappointing. But this is usually part of the process before larger trends begin to form. So instead of asking when XRP will reach a certain price, a better question to ask is whether the conditions for growth are improving, because if they are, then the price will eventually reflect that progress, even if it doesn't happen immediately. Now, let's talk about risk because no investment discussion is complete without it. And in crypto, risk is always present, no matter how strong the fundamentals may be. And this is why managing your expectations and your exposure is extremely important. XRP, like any other cryptocurrency, can be highly volatile, meaning the price can move up and down quickly, and this can create both opportunities and risks depending on how you approach the market. And this is why you should never invest based on emotion or hype alone. It is also important to remember that the crypto market is influenced by many external factors, including global economic conditions, regulatory changes, and overall investor sentiment. And any of these can impact XRP's price at any time. So when you think about these insane predictions, you should see them as possibilities, not guarantees. And your goal should be to stay informed, stay patient, and make decisions based on logic rather than excitement. As we close this discussion, keep in mind that understanding the market is not about predicting the exact future, but about preparing for different outcomes. And this is what gives you confidence and control in a space that is often unpredictable. If you found this breakdown helpful and you want more, clear and simple explanations like this, make sure to stay connected, keep learning, and continue building your understanding step by step, because in this market, knowledge is one of your strongest advantages. And finally, here is something very important you must always remember. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice, because investing in cryptocurrencies involves risk, and you should always do your own research before making any decisions. Never invest money you cannot afford to lose. And if needed, consider speaking with a financial professional to guide you based on your personal situation.